Hello, we'll get started in about 5 minutes. Hello, everyone. Welcome. And I'm glad that you're joining us. My name is Amy Rossio, and I'm a nurse planner here at ONA. I'd like to introduce Rose Sherman. She is editor-in-chief of Nurse Leader, the official journal of the American Organization of Nurse Executives. She also released a book recently, and it is titled The Nurse Leader Coach, Become the Boss No One Wants to Leave. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rose.
Okay, well, listen, thank you, Amy, and welcome to everyone listening on the webinar live, and also to those of you watching this after we have broadcast. This webinar has been specifically designed for emerging leaders, but I think the content will also be very valuable to those of you that have already moved into a formal leadership role. We've divided it into 3 sections, and we will be taking questions after each section. So be sure to post your questions throughout the webinar, and we're going to attempt to answer as many of the questions as we can during this 1-hour broadcast. You know, more than a decade ago, Marshall Goldsmith, who is a thought leader in leadership development, wrote a best-selling book that was titled, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And the major point of the book is that when leaders or professionals derail or fail to achieve their goals, it's usually because they won't change and grow to fit the new realities of their situation. So I think when we talk about leadership, it's really important that we recognize that the willingness to maintain a growth mindset is really a key behavior, because leadership is a journey. And across your professional life, you've probably already may have seen some dramatic changes in healthcare and nursing. And to succeed, you're going to have to be willing to adapt and change. So keep this in mind as we cover the content in the program. Above all else, leadership is a journey. It's not a destination. You will never fully arrive to a point that you stop learning and growing. So a willingness to change and grow is really key in leadership. We have 3 topics that we're going to cover today that are really critical to your growth as a leader. In our first topic, we'll look at how do you set the stage for a career in leadership. What should you be doing? What should you be thinking about? In our second topic, we'll look at how to develop your leadership skills, both within your organization and outside your organization. And our last topic involves how to build a strong professional brand, which is really key to a successful leadership career, but it's one that we don't talk a lot about in nursing. Now on the screen, this slide contains a quote from John Quincy Adams, and it really makes a key point about leadership, that leadership is not a role, and this is important to understand. It's all about your ability to effectively influence others. To be a successful leader, you really must have followers. Now, it's often said that the only thing that a leadership title will buy you is time, because leadership above all else is really about trust and influence. And I'm sure that you can probably think of many individuals in your own professional life or maybe personal life who are in leadership roles, but they don't really have the influence to be effective. You've probably also seen others who are informal leaders that really have a tremendous impact over their peers. So this brings us to our first polling question, and we'd like to know if you're currently in a leadership role. And we'll take a moment here, and Amy's going to tally our results for us. I say the poll is open right now. Okay, we'll give it another minute. Do we have some results coming in, Amy?
Yes, we do. We have 75% of the people have voted.
Okay, well, go ahead and tell us what the results show.
Okay, 67% stated number 4, no, they're not currently a leader. 33% stated 2, yes, that they are a leader in a professional or association.
Okay, super, super. So, so that's good to know. That means we're hitting our target audience. That most of you out there right now are in emerging leader role, are in an emerging leader position. So as we talked about before, you really can't be an effective leader without having followers. And that's why leadership begins within us. Personal mastery is really essential before you can lead others. And most leaders will tell you that the most challenging person that you're ever going to lead is yourself. And if you can manage your own thoughts, your own emotions, and your own reactions well, you're really ready to begin leading others. For many leaders, this is really a struggle. Now, there are 3 components to self-management. The first is self-knowledge, because leadership is really an inside-outside job. So you must know yourself in order to be authentic in your work. The second component is emotional intelligence, which many of you are probably familiar with. And we now know that EI, as it's called, is much more critical to success than IQ. And the last is resiliency, which we know today, in today's often stressful and chaotic healthcare environment, it's really becoming a much needed professional competency, but one we don't always recognize as a needed competency. Now, on this slide this slide features a Business Week cover from the late 1990s with Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker is often called the father of American management. He was truly a pioneer in studying how leaders can improve their practice and advocated that leaders should be knowledgeable about themselves. And he talked about 4 key areas where you need to really be knowledgeable about yourself. And the first one is what are your strengths? What are your innate talents? What do you do that's effortless for you, but perhaps very challenging for others? Now, there are assessments to help you with this, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But knowing your strengths is a key to self-knowledge. The second piece of self-knowledge that's important is how do you get things done? Are you, as an example, are you a reader or are you a listener? Do you prefer to work alone or do you need to be part of a team? Do you work best in the morning or the afternoon? Now, this type of self-knowledge helps us to structure our work, and it can also be a clue as to why some environments may be perfect for our work and others are not. For example, if you're a people person, I recently had one of my graduate students that took a utilization review position, and she's a real people person. She found she really isn't that happy in a role that really requires her to sit in front of the computer a good portion of the day and review patient records. So for her, that would have been important self-knowledge to know probably before she had taken that role. The third involves your personal values, and personal values can serve as a litmus test as to why a job might be right for you or might not be right for you. Does the organization's mission, vision, and values align with your own? Some nurses really feel very, very comfortable working in faith-based organizations. Others may not feel as comfortable working in faith-based organizations, but the mission, vision, and value don't need to be the same, but they do need to be, your values need to be very close to the organization's values. Otherwise, it's going to feel very incongruent to you, and you're going to kind of wonder, why am I not happy here? And the last question to ask yourself is, where do you belong in the world? Now, some roles are going to be a great fit with your strengths and others may not. And it takes courage and insight to realize that. So for some of you, you're not currently in a formal leadership role. You may decide you really don't want to be in a formal leadership role, and that's fine. It's just important that you know yourself what's best for you. Have you ever thought about your own strengths and talents? The question on this slide, these slides are really good ones to ask yourself and for your professional colleagues that know you well. What's really interesting is that we often are not the best judges of our own strengths and talents. And part of the reason is that sometimes when things come so easily to us, we assume that they come easily to others, and we could be very wrong about this. Now, one of the best instruments that I've found to really evaluate your strengths is the Clifton Strength Finder. If you buy any of the Gallup books, this book that is in the slide happens to be Strength Finders 2.0, but if you buy any of the Gallup books, new, that's the key. You got to buy it new. You're going to find a code in the book that you can take the Strength Finder online. Now, if you take it, really carefully look through the assessment and think about how you can use your strengths to grow professionally in your work. It's interesting that Gallup data shows that if you know and you use your strengths, you're 6 times more likely to be engaged in your work. So that's important information to know. Now, when we look at why nurses fail in any role, really any professional role, it's usually not because they lack the skill set, but more often it's related to their emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence has 4 major components. The first component is self-awareness, and this is how well do you know yourself and how you emotionally react in situations. Also, how emotions impact your thoughts. If you're very self-aware, you know the kinds of situations that are going to trigger stress and anxiety for you, and you might even avoid those situations because you have such a high level of self-awareness about that. The second key component to emotional intelligence is the whole idea around self-management. And this is your ability to really control your impulsive thoughts and feelings so that you don't get derailed. Let's say you are in a very stressful situation. Sometimes when people are in very stressful situations, they may lash out. They may say things that they're sorry that they said. They may talk too much. So self-management becomes important because if you're self-aware and you know how you might react, the next piece of it is, are you able to manage those emotions? So the ability to really control your own emotions. The third part of emotional intelligence is social awareness, and this is really understanding the emotions, the needs, and concerns of others. Being able to kind of walk in a room, and I'm sure a lot of us have had this experience where we walk in a room and you just know that you're going to fit in. It's very friendly. People seem to be enjoying themselves. They seem to be having a good time. And other situations, maybe you sense a lot of stress in the situation. So picking up these emotional cues and the politics in situations become important so that you really don't do something awkward. And then the last component of emotional intelligence is relationship management. And this is your knowing how to develop and maintain good relationships with others, how to communicate clearly, how to navigate conflict, being sensitive to the ideas and thoughts of others and the triggers of others so that you manage the relationship as well as you can. Now, most of us are good at some of these components, but usually need to work on others. So remember, your emotional intelligence is really more important than your IQ to advance. And one of the instruments that I like came from an excellent article that was published in the Harvard Business Review by Dr. Annie McCree, that includes both a self-assessment and also questions to ask a trusted colleague. Because what we've learned about emotional intelligence through research is that sometimes we may not be the best judges of our own emotional intelligence. So a really great growth experience is to take the risk to ask a colleague for feedback about how you're doing. And then the third component of self-management is our ability to build resiliency or bounce back from situations. And this is a picture of Dr. Martin Seligman from the University of Pennsylvania Resiliency Project. Now, all of us will have setbacks and failures in our professional life. You can't escape it. I guarantee you that if it hasn't happened yet, it will happen. But Dr. Seligman, who is considered to be the father of positive psychology, points out that our explanatory style plays a very big role in our resilience. And explanatory style is, how do you explain to yourself what has happened? You may have a natural tendency to a very positive explanatory style, or you may have a tendency to have a negative approach when you suffer a severe setback in your life. You may be a glass half empty type of person. And if you see a setback as being a catastrophic failure, you're likely to have less resilience. So the stories, Dr. Seligman tells us, the stories that we tell ourselves become very, very powerful about what has happened to us. And another consideration is, how much do you ruminate? And ruminate is when something stressful happens to you, do you play that tape over and over and over in your minds? Do you ruminate a great deal? I have a colleague that tells me that she's the queen of rumination. What we know from the research is that this rumination really contributes to stress and anxiety levels. So resiliency, what we've learned is that it's the key in leadership today, because you're always going to have these setbacks in your life, and so it is important to really understand how to manage them, because if we don't manage them well, then work stress can easily lead to burnout and disengagement. And this is why we need to assume responsibility for our own resiliency. Now, you see on the slide here that this soldier is wearing armor, and the ability to be resilient has actually been described as psychological armor. And the term came from the military, because when the U.S. first went into Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 1990s, the military noticed that the rates of PTSD among veterans who served in combat zones was really skyrocketing, and that actually continues to this day. And so what they did was they turned to Dr. Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania for help. And what he did was he initiated a resiliency project started with the Army to fortify these soldiers in advance of their going into these combat zones with resiliency strategies to prevent the onset of PTSD. And one of the most important resiliency strategies that Dr. Seligman learned from his research is, if you can change the stories that people tell themselves about what's happening to them, you can really build their resiliency in a pretty profound way. Now, on this slide, we have some of the evidence-based strategies to really build resiliency. These are some of the key ones that you can incorporate into your life. I'm going to just talk about two of the ones that we've got some really good research in nursing. The first one involves sleep. We know that as a professional group, our nurses really don't sleep enough, yet sleep has been found to really promote resiliency. Another strategy on this list is gratitude. the three things to be grateful for. And it's really interesting because one of the things that we're seeing in some health systems right now is that they're incorporating gratitude into the end of shift huddle, because nurses very often after they've worked a shift, they go home and all they think about is what they didn't do during their work, not what they did do. So it's really important to think about what you're grateful for. So try something on this list if you're not already doing it, and remember that resiliency is really now a core professional competency. Now, Amy, that brings us to the end of the first part of our webinar, and we're going to open it up for questions that are coming in around the content that we just presented. So do we have some questions, Amy?
I would like for our attendees to use the question box. So you're free to ask a question right now.
I have one. Rose, you talked about we're responsible for our own resiliency, but can you give us some more ideas about, I like that idea a lot, that like the nurse themselves is responsible for their own resiliency. But when you as a leader are noticing that people aren't doing those positive behaviors, that there is a lack of resiliency around your coworkers, what kinds of things can we be doing to help influence that?
Well, I think, one of the things that we've seen is that on some units where either the manager or the professional practice council sees that there are stress and burnout, high stress and burnout levels, that they start programs. And one of the ones that I really liked that was started at one of the children's hospitals in Chicago was called like a Jump Start program, where they specifically they picked a different resiliency strategy for each week. Let's say they did it across 6 weeks, and they chose a different resiliency strategy each week, and kind of talked about what it was about, and the staff tried the resiliency strategy and then gave them some feedback about how it was working. So, whether it be sleep, whether it be a gratitude journal, whether it be maybe wearing a Fitbit and or an iWatch and doing 10,000 steps, whatever the strategy was for the week, they went ahead and really promoted it and taught staff about it, and then kind of assessed how did it work.
I like that.
That's a wonderful example. I have a scenario here that maybe you can help us with while we're waiting for questions. This scenario states that I think I want to move into a leadership position, but I'm very anxious about the possibility that I could fail in the role. Do you have any suggestions for me?
Well, first of all, I'd say that your feelings are not uncommon. And fear, to a certain point, I think is healthy, because it reminds you that you don't know what you don't know. And I think that can be a really good thing. Because when leaders fail, as we talked about, it's usually not because they lack skills, but because they're not self-aware and they're not teachable. So if you're self-aware and you're teachable, you can learn these leadership skills. And sometimes, you as one of my young managers once told me, sometimes you just got to feel the fear and do it anyway, because authentic leaders are really vulnerable. And the fact that you can ask this question indicates to me that you have great leadership potential.
Okay. I have another scenario. I'm very talented at working with people, but terrible with numbers and money. I know budgets are part of leadership, but what if you don't have the talent to manage a budget?
Okay, well, I think the good news is that the strengths that you're mentioning here, the talent in working with people, these are really the key in leadership. I often say that the soft skills can be the hard skills. It's easier to teach. It's easier to teach a new manager how to do a budget, how to do a staffing plan, than it is to teach a new manager how to communicate well with other people, how to negotiate conflict, how to, recognize staff. Those skills can become more challenging for people to learn than financial skills. But having said that, budget management is a learned skill that you can't avoid. So I would say get help, get lots of help, and keep getting help until you feel proficient. And don't be intimidated. Just spend the time and keep learning. Sometimes we underestimate our capabilities. And so, and also remember that if you learn a lot about budgeting, this is going to not only help you at work, it's also going to help you in your professional life, in your personal life as well, with your personal finances.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? If not, we can go ahead and move on.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so we're now moving into part 2 of the webinar, and we're going to be talking about how to develop your leadership skills. Now, it's not uncommon when nurses consider moving into a new leadership role, they may actually feel like an imposter, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the term imposter syndrome. And this might be especially true if you're just at the very beginning of your nursing career and you all of a sudden advance. No one expects you to have all the answers, and humility can be a very good thing. However, it's important to project confidence in your ability to be successful, even if you're a rookie in your role. And projecting confidence is part of what you'll hear described as executive presence. Which is your communication, your confidence, how you dress, your body language. And many leaders will candidly tell you that they kind of fake it till they make it in their roles, because it is so important that other people have confidence in you, even when you may not have total confidence in yourself. Now, I recently, had a young nurse ask me, one of the things that when you're first starting out in your career, you wonder, how do I get the types of positions that I'm interested in? And this particular young nurse was interested in a very non-traditional role, which was working in robotics. She had a degree in biomedical and a degree in nursing, but didn't even know how to really begin a job search. And there's a very good book that was published by Ken Coleman, who's part of the Ramsey Leadership Group, that's titled The Proximity Principle. And I think Coleman makes an important point that if you see a role that you're interested in, you need to meet the people, be in the places, and develop the skills that they have. So I always think a great question to ask when you meet someone that's in a role that you think that you might be interested in, ask them how they got the job. Every story is going to be a little different, but it does give you insight into what their journey was like. As an example, with this young nurse, I gave her the name of a nurse leader who's currently serving as a clinical consultant in a robotics company, and urged her to have a short conversation. And this is really how these connections are made and how you find out about roles that you could be interested in. One question that I get frequently asked by nurses is, how do I get noticed in my own organization? I work for a very big health system. I see that there are good jobs. I put in for them, but sometimes I never even make it to the interview stage. And I think that it's important to recognize that getting noticed doesn't just happen. It does take some intentionality on your part, and some of the good ways to get noticed in your organization are to do things like join a professional practice council, particularly one that might be at the hospital level. Volunteer for a stretch assignment, even if it means doing some work on your personal time. Set up and share a community event like a Heart Walk or a United Way drive. That makes a big impression and gives you very high visibility in your organization. I think it's important that you also express an interest in leadership or any professional position that you're interested in getting. Sometimes we think that people will automatically know what it is that we want to do. And that's not true. You know, leaders are not mind readers. They don't know what you're interested in unless you let them know. And then once you let people know, gee, I'm really interested in clinical informatics, I would be so interested in joining that kind of department if there's ever an opportunity, then you'll be top of mind as folks consider candidates. And also, I always recommend finding a mentor, and a mentor should be somebody that maybe is sitting in the type of position that you would like to at one point achieve, somebody that you respect a lot, that you can ask questions of, and that you feel comfortable with. Now, there's 3 areas when you're being evaluated for either professional, advanced professional, or leadership positions. There's 3 key roles that are always being looked at. The first are your communication skills, which include your verbal communication, your nonverbal, and in today's world, it's very important that you think about your digital body language as well, which consists of things like how responsive are you on email? What do your explanations look like? What do your text messages look like? Are you respectful? Do you use professional language? Do you avoid the use of all caps? Those are the kinds of things to be thinking about in your communication. A second area is whether you're a good follower in it, because this is key. You know, in leadership roles, you will lead, but you will always often be taking strategic direction from others as well. So how well you can do that is something that folks really look at. And a third skill that's really considered as you look at advancing up the career ladder is whether you're a good team player. You know, it's often said that healthcare is a team sport, and you can be a great individual contributor, but in healthcare, it's important that you know how to work on teams. And even as a leader, you're always going to be working on teams, such as the leadership team. So how effective are you in working with your team? And then, you know, I think it's important to always reflect on asking yourself things like, am I a good communicator? Do I accept delegation? Do I give good team backup when others ask me to do things for them? You know, you know, really being very honest with yourself about some of the areas that you may be doing well in and others that you may need to improve. Now, this slide kind of indicates some of the derailers in leadership, because when leaders derail, it's usually not, as I mentioned before, because they lack skills around budgeting, staffing, human resource management. It's really more their soft skills. So some of the common derailers, not only in leadership, but in professional life in general, is the first one is trying to add too much value to discussions. This is when you always feel a need to contribute to a discussion, whether or not you really have anything valuable to say. If people are giving you written work, you feel a compulsion to change some of the sentences, add things, subtract things. So, you know, adding some value is good, too much value, not good. How much do you interrupt others? If you have a tendency to interrupt others in conversation, really monitor yourself on that. I think this third one is really key as well, taking credit for accomplishments that are really team efforts, not just an individual effort. I always look, when I'm listening to leaders, I always listen for how often that leader uses the word I versus we. Because excessive use of the word I kind of indicates that you're really not being an inclusive leader and recognizing the efforts of the team. Another derailer is being unwilling to accept feedback on your behavior. It can be extremely difficult to listen to feedback, but it's one of the most important professional and leadership lessons that we need to learn. The only way that we really grow is by getting this feedback. So how we accept the feedback that we get becomes very important. Failing to communicate important information, and of course, being unresponsive to the requests of others. an often overlooked way to gain leadership experience, either while you're in school or maybe early in your career, is through professional associations. Now, I often hear young nurses tell me today that they don't see a point in investing in becoming members of associations because it seems so indirectly related to their work. And what I would say in response to that is that most nurses that I know have really not built the type of networks that they need to truly achieve professional success. You know, having a network and of professional colleagues is really key. And that's something that a professional association really allows you to do. In my own area of leadership, I have seen leaders that have either been downsized from an organization or maybe lost their position in an organization, and they really find themselves with no real network outside of their own health system. And this is a big mistake in healthcare because the very best jobs, whether in healthcare or other industries, are really not advertised. And so these relationships really matter, and they need to be beyond social media. So really be thinking about your professional association in a very different way. So in terms of other leadership development strategies to be thinking about, I think that participating on community and state task forces, even running for public office, you know, we have a congressional representative now, Lauren Underwood, who comes from the state of Illinois. And Lauren's only 32 years old, and she's a nurse practitioner who successfully ran and won her congressional race. First time she ever ran for office was in 2018. Seek mentorship from leaders that you respect. Join a Toastmasters group. You know, a lot of nurses fear public speaking, yet it's critical in leadership roles and it can be learned. So consider Toastmasters. Work on your executive presence, how you dress, your demeanor, your confidence. And then if you implement some or all of these strategies, I think you'll see that it's pretty amazing how quickly you'll develop in your leadership. So some of the lessons that I've learned over time that I just want to share before we move into some questions is that leadership is really, you know, career success is incremental. Today it can be fast tracked. I think people are moving up the career ladder much faster than they ever have before, but there's still dues to be paid. Good habits are key. You know, we're learning more and more about the role of habits in our lives, habits like reading, taking time for professional development, networking. Professional development is the key. You can't and won't ever have it all figured out. So it's important to be really not only continue learning, but also be reflective about experiences that you have. And the last thing that I've learned about career success is not to immediately shut down new possibilities. When you first start out, say yes more than you say no. You know, remain very curious about the work of others, and be ready to establish relationships with people outside of nursing. Really stay open. So that brings us to the end of the second part of the presentation. And Amy, do we have some questions that have come in?
We don't at the moment, but I do have a scenario here for you. What would you suggest if you work for a leader who blocks your career advancement? It's very discouraging. What would you say that I would do?
Okay, that's I think that's a really good question, Amy, because it's one that I've encountered too often, I would say, with young nurses, is that their managers may not be supportive of their career goals for a variety of reasons. And sometimes I think you have to kind of understand sometimes that people have different motivations, but that manager may see you as a very talented person and fear the competition. They may not be very secure about their own place in the organization. They could be jealous that senior leadership has really noticed your skills. They may, and this is increasingly more common, be concerned about losing you as a clinically experienced and competent staff member. Some managers may feel you're trying to move too fast. But, I think what's important to realize in these situations, if when you encounter this, is that you need to take the high road despite feeling disappointed and feeling a lack of support. Always behave professionally and never say negative things about the manager. It might also be important to do an honest assessment about where you are in your current role. Ask yourself if you're really ready for the promotion that you're seeking and if your work achievements reflect positively on your manager and your team. If you can't, if you don't have that support from the manager, I think it is important to find a mentor that will support your career aspirations.
Do you advise this person to be open with their manager and say that I'm not trying to threaten your position or?
Yeah, I think I probably would approach it. I probably wouldn't approach it exactly that way. What I would say is to the manager that I'm sensing some reluctance on your part in thinking that I'm ready for advancement. Am I right about this? What are your thoughts about where I am right now in my career and what my potential is? And I think that kind of opens the conversation. Now, having said that, you might find that the manager will tell you that she doesn't think you're ready. And so I would explore that a little bit more. And then you have to decide yourself whether this is an assessment that you agree with or disagree with. I would always thank a leader for their assessment of where I am in my career, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate.
Okay. It's also very hard with getting that kind of feedback, and it makes some people very anxious. How would you suggest that they get over that?
Yeah, I think that the first step is, remember, we talked earlier about this whole idea about a growth mindset. I think that the way that you have to really think about feedback is that the feedback is providing you with an opportunity to get better professionally. It's not calling out failure, which is immediately the default that a lot of us go to when we hear feedback. Oh, I must be failing. They don't like what I did. Instead of viewing it as a growth opportunity. So I think it's always important to thank others for feedback, even when it's not helpful. Just say, thank you for sharing that. You don't necessarily have to agree with it. Just say, thank you for sharing that.
Okay. What if someone lacks confidence in giving presentations? How do they go about getting over that fear?
Well, it's interesting because they wouldn't be alone. Fear of public speaking is the number one fear that people have in the United States. And when you see nurses give excellent, smooth presentations, you're probably watching somebody that has had years of practice. So recognize that. So I would suggest that, you begin small. With maybe presenting on your unit, thinking about Toastmasters, watching TED Talks and how people present. Initially, you may really need to you may feel fear, but I would say you've got to kind of push your way through the fear and recognize that nobody hits it out of the ballpark with every presentation, but you do learn and get better every time you do it.
Okay, thank you. Are there
Okay.
any other questions? Okay, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, let's move. This is the last part of our webinar, and we'll look at how to build a strong professional brand. And, it's interesting because we know that companies have brands, but nurses often don't think about the idea of their own professional brand. But you have a brand whether you think you do or not. And I love what Jeff Bezos says here, that your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. And so you need to think about that, because if you're looking to advance your career, you want to have some control over the messaging that other people and thoughts that other people have about you. And that, in fact, is your professional brand. Now, some of you probably say, why do I need this? What difference does this make at this point in my career? But what I think a brand does for you is, we're in a knowledge economy, but also a very competitive economy. And so it differentiates you from other people, because it tells the world, what makes me uniquely different from others. It can guide you in your career planning, because it focuses your work on activities to build your brand, and it helps you define yourself rather than having someone else define you. I really like the work of Donald Miller, who wrote the book Story Brand, because he makes the point that the best brands really solve a problem. So let's say you're an oncology nurse and you're absolutely passionate about preventative screening for whatever area of oncology that you're in. That would be your problem. That would be the problem that you would be looking to address as part of your professional brand. Then the important thing is to have a clear message about, what does the picture look like right now in oncology in terms of preventative care? What are you seeing in terms of people coming in with end stage cancers that have never gotten any preventative screening? And then, tell a compelling story, because people really respond to stories more than they respond to facts. So have some good stories to tell about the work that you're doing. And this is a really thinking about story is a good way to think about the focus of your own work, because what a brand does is it really expresses your character, your reputation, how you're presenting to the world, what your impact is. It really talks about the impression that you're making, and then your values, strengths, and uniqueness of experience. One of the most valuable things about thinking of yourself, thinking through your brand and your work, is so that you can identify what you uniquely bring to the table. Right now, we're working across the country to place nurses on boards. There's a whole initiative called Nurses on Boards. But the reality is, it's not just about getting on a board that's important. It's what are you going to do when you get to the board? What unique value are you really bringing to this board? And let's say, going back to our example of this oncology nurse who's passionate about preventative screening, if that nurse went on a local cancer society board, that would be the focus of why she would be there, is to really look at what the organization is doing in terms of prevention, volunteering her time. And going back to Lauren Underwood, the nurse practitioner that ran for Congress, her unique value proposition in that election was that she was a nurse who understood the healthcare delivery system and health insurance. So she focused on the problem was pre-existing conditions and how many families have been devastated when they're diagnosed with illnesses and can't get coverage. She made it healthcare her issue in that election, her value proposition, and it resonated. So the question is, many of you probably thinking right now, well, how do I even get started doing this? And I think a good first step is to really think about your key attributes. And on this slide, we have some key attributes that you might want to incorporate into your brand. What are you especially, what do people tell you about yourself? Do they tell you that you're a very empathic person? Do they tell you that you're a great mentor? Do they tell you you're reliable? Don't underestimate reliability. Reliability is important, important value in today's society. Are you someone that really looks at evidence and research, and what you have to say is very evidence-based? So think about the key attributes that you have that you want to incorporate into your brand. And once you identify those key attributes, consider your behaviors and actions. Are they really consistent with the brand that you want to have? Just like the brands that we buy, our personal brands are built over time. And trust is not immediate. People are not automatically going to trust you professionally. That happens over time, and it happens with consistency of behavior. So some key areas in leadership brand building, but certainly in professional brand building as well in today's environment include your online presence, which we'll talk a little more about, your publications, if you've written anything or think about writing anything. I think writing content, whether it be for blogs, whether it be for journals, whether it be for newsletters, is an important way to get messages out that you really do want to get out. Your presentations, your professional service, your social competence and networking are also something to think about. Online presence is really a must today for professionals. LinkedIn, a strong LinkedIn profile is essential, and a professional Facebook page may be a good idea depending on what role you're in. When nurses tell me that they're nationally known for this or nationally known for that, one of the things I advise that they do is go ahead and Google themselves, because that's what people do when you tell them that you're known for something, is they look for consistency. If you think you're nationally known, is that showing up online in any way? Now, depending on your professional goals, you might at some point want to think about things like blogging or podcasting, a video blog, or even having a YouTube channel. Which kind of brings us to our second and final polling question, which is, do you have a strong online professional presence right now? So Amy, if you could run that poll for us.
Okay, we have 25% voted. Now it's
Okay.
up to 50. Okay. We'll give it a few more seconds. And go ahead and vote on your computer rather than in the question box. Well, we're still at 50% voted. But
Okay,
we
well,
have,
we can let's just look at those results, even with 50%. Amy, what are you seeing?
So 50% state number 4, no, I don't
Okay.
have this time, and
Okay.
50% state 2, yes, but
Okay.
could be improved.
Great. So that gives us a place to start. I want to start with presentations, because I think presentations can be a really key way of disseminating your knowledge as a professional. And I equate it to kind of the metaphor of the rock band, because you always need to start small. Any rock band that you see out there, they didn't start on the national stage. They started really in a garage. And that's the way to think about it with presentations. If you want to become known in your area, start small, accept every opportunity to really talk about your expertise, whether it be on your own unit, in your medical center, or outside in the community. Volunteer to present at high schools, seek feedback. And if you do go to professional conferences, and maybe you'll have the opportunity to present at a professional conference, but don't underestimate the power of posters at conferences as well, to really present material that you think is important for others to know, because it really gives you a great opportunity to talk with others about your work. Some lessons that I have learned about social competence is that, you can easily derail your brand through blind spots, hubris, or just insensitivity. So, always be gracious. People care less about your credentials and or school you graduated from, and ultimately It's always about the audience or whoever it is that you're talking with. Be generous in sharing what you know. Sometimes people think, well, I'll give up power if I share this information. And it's really quite the opposite. You really gain power by sharing what you know. Refer work outside your expertise to other professionals. Be a mentor and coach yourself, and be organizationally and socially aware. Now, think about your leadership. It's really important as you develop yourself as a leader and professional. Keep in mind that it is a journey, that you never will quite arrive. And as time changes, you may need to shift your thinking on things. John Maxwell, in his new book called Leadership, says that you cannot be the same, think the same, act the same in a world that does not remain the same. So staying open and staying curious and watching the signposts. I think reading broadly the news, politics, business, looking at demographics. What are the experts saying? How might this, always asking the question, how might this really impact my professional work? So a final thought is it's so easy, after a presentation like this to say, well, that was interesting. And that's kind of as far as it goes. But what is important is that you have to start someplace. So what I would urge you to do is to maybe take one or two ideas that we've talked about in this webinar and just implement them, just get started. Get started into your journey in leadership, no matter, where it takes you. And Amy, that brings us to the end of the presentation. So we can take questions about this section or anything else that's on the minds of the participants.
Well, Rose, what would you suggest that someone put in their LinkedIn profile?
Okay, great question. I think that because LinkedIn is such a part of professional branding, and a lot of nurses don't realize how widely LinkedIn is being used today by not only recruiters, but other people that are interested in your work. What I would recommend is that you watch there's some really good YouTubes out there that will give you some direction. But what they're going to tell you, a few key things that you're going to hear on these videos is that having a very good professional picture is important, because that kind of sets the stage. So, if you want to appear as a professional, you've got to have a professional picture. A very strong introduction. There's an introduction part of LinkedIn, and really a good about section in your profile. And then what's really critical is keep it updated. This is important, and develop connections. This is a good way to connect. When you meet someone at a conference, you can automatically go back and try to connect with them on LinkedIn.
Would you suggest that they have different Facebook pages as well? Maybe just a personal one and a professional one?
Well, that's a great question, Amy. That's something I always recommend to leaders, especially, is that I think, you have to be very careful if you're widely sharing your personal Facebook page and you're putting things on there that you might not want people to know about, that are professional associates but not personal friends. So I think the idea of a professional Facebook page can be a really excellent idea, especially as you as you advance in your career.
And lastly, what did you mean about worrying about insensitivities?
I think, we were talking about insensitivity in terms of the way others are perceiving us, Amy. Is that what was that the context to the question? I'm really not sure.
Yes, you said to be sensitive to the fact that you may say things that are insensitive. If you could just expand upon that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's really important. That's part of that. Kind of gets back to that social awareness part of emotional intelligence. I think that, as an example, a good example in today's environment is that I think if you're in professional situations, you've got to be sensitive about differing political viewpoints. You have to be sensitive about different viewpoints around religion, around race. And so maybe there are certain conversations or questions or comments that you just don't make in those settings, that you might be okay at home in your living room if you're by yourself, but oversharing your opinions about things that others could feel very, very differently about, and perhaps very strongly about, is something that you do need to watch as a professional.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 2 more minutes left, and if there are any other questions, please type them in your question box. And maybe during this time, Rose can expand upon the idea of a professional brand and the fine line between that and being a self-promoter.
Well, I think that's a good point, Amy, because anything can be overdone, including professional branding. And there may be people who see you as a self-promoter even when you're not over the top in what you're doing. So I think one thing that we don't always recognize when we start our professional careers is, as you advance your professional ladder and you advance in your positions, you're really always going to have critics. That is the truth. But you have to be sensitive to those critics and always ask yourself, is there a grain of truth in what they're saying? So, have trusted colleagues. I find that having trusted colleagues whose feedback you trust can really keep you grounded when you are asking, am I out there too much? As an example, there's some leadership, there's some folks that are in leadership today that are just all over social media. So the question would be, am I trying to brand myself too much, too often? Are people getting tired of seeing my name? And I think those are questions you can ask trusted colleagues.
Okay, I do have a question from Tracy. She says, I would like to ask you about the difference between leadership and management positions.
Okay, great question, because management is a position. It is a position. Leadership is something different. Leadership is about your ability to provide vision, about your ability to influence others. So management is more about when I think of management, I think more about the operational part of it, managing budget, managing staff. And we know that some managers are leaders, some managers are not leaders. So great question, and there definitely is a difference.
Okay,
I would say management is more about position, leadership is more about a way of being.
Okay, good response. Any other questions? Okay, I don't see any others, so let me wrap this up by telling you that your certificate will be given to you after you complete the SurveyMonkey that will be sent to you in about an hour after this broadcast. And it is attached to the SurveyMonkey, so you have to complete the evaluation before getting that. Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate Rose's expertise, and thank you for participating, and have a good day.
Thank you, Amy.